guys, we are at the Bellagio. I already had some drinks with my girlfriend, but I still want to play a session. So I guess a 1-3 session it will be. So stay tuned, have fun, and wish us luck. So hello guys and welcome back to the poker vlog here at the beautiful poker room at Bellagio in Las Vegas. We are playing 1-3, there's a $300 max buy-in and we are in for 300 this time. There will be a new little feature at my vlog. You probably saw it in other vlogs as well. It's a timer, a clock, so you can see how much time is going by between the hands. You can see how card dead or hot I'm running, and I hope you enjoy it. I started the session at around 1:40 in the morning and it took me some time till we get the first hand. It's already 2 AM before we pick up Queen Jack from under the gun. I raise it up to 10 here and it folds the button who calls, and the small blind and the big blind come along as well. We go 4 ways to a flop of King Jack 9 Rainbow. Pretty connected board, and after the blinds check to me I decide to check back and the button does the same. We see a deuce which completes the rainbow on the turn and the blinds check to me again. With my second pair and the gut shot to the straight, I think I have to bet here for value since no one showed interest into the pot, so I bet 20 and only the big blind decides to call. We see the 8 of spades on the river and the board is pretty connected now. There are some possible 2-pair combination who got there, maybe some disguised straights, but the big blind checks to me. Because of the named reason, I don't want to get check raised here and I decide to check back with my second pair. I show my hand and we are good. The big blind later mentioned that he had a jack as well, but we will never know, and we scoop in the first pot of the night. Not so much time goes by until we pick up our next hand here in the small blind with ace jack of hearts. We see a straddle from the under the gun player to 6 and the +1 player raises it up to 12. There's one caller before it folds to me and I think I could 3-bet here sometimes, but in the suited variety I think I can call here as well, sometimes out of position. And the table is pretty tight so far as well, so I think I only get called by way better hands than mine. And after I call, the big blind has a very good price to call as well, and the under the gun player of course too. We see a flop 5 ways. The dealer rolls over Jack 10-8. So we flop ourselves top pair, top kicker, but on a pretty connected board. At least there is no flush draw so far. And the +1 player plays in flow and c-bets this board, but pretty small again. He bets $15. The caller before me gets out of the way and I have a clear call here in my opinion. The other players, the big blind and the gun player, get out of the way and we are heads up now. We see a turn in form of the 10 of clubs. It brings in the backdoor flush draw, the board is paired now. Overall this card is definitely good for me. I think my opponent shouldn't have many 10s that he c-bets here on the flop, but I decide to play in flow here as well and check to my opponent. He keeps betting, this time for 30. Because this 10 shouldn't change too much and he still could have hands like ace king, king queen, ace queen, maybe a hand like ace 9 of clubs or something like that. I decide to call and re-evaluate on the river. I'm not so sure about the river, it brings in the 8 of clubs. So at least the obvious straight draw is bricked completely, but it brings in the backdoor flush draw. I think my hand plays best here as a bluff catcher. I see no good point in betting here. Maybe I should fold when my opponent bets pretty big here on the river, but let's see how it goes. I check to my opponent and he thinks for a while and then decides to bet again. This time for 60. I know that line seems pretty strong, but in the situation I couldn't help myself and stick in the call, and we get the bad news because my opponent rolls over ace king of clubs. So he was on some sort of draw on the flop and turn, but got there on the river unfortunately. We lose this one and after that hand I rebuy for another 100, so we are into the game for 400 now. Let's see if we can turn things around. Have I mentioned the table is pretty tight so far? I guess I'm the loosest player at the table and that is pretty rare. It's about 2:40 in the morning and I look down at ace 7 of clubs in the cutoff. There's a straddle to 6 again and it folds to me and I raise it up to 18. The small blind and the straddler decide to call. We see a flop of 9-6 deuce with 2 diamonds and 1 spade. They check to me and I see no reason to c-bet here on this board, so I check back. We see the king of spades on the turn and they check to me again. This card should definitely be better for my range than it should be for my opponent's ranges, and they showed weakness, so I bet 25, even though I have no equity at all. The small blind decides to call, but at least the under the gun straddler gets out of the way. We see the 4 of spades on the river and the small blind checks to me again. I sit here with ace high, don't think I'm good here like almost ever. My opponent could have some missed straight or flush draws, but most likely sits on a middling pair, I guess. And because of the reason the table is so tight so far, I think I can steal this pot away if I bet here. So I go for it this time. I bet 45, make it look like it's for value with a king. My opponent snap folds. So we got this one through. Phew, on to the next one. Here in the next one we are in the big blind with ace queen offsuit. It folds to the cutoff who raises to 10, the button and the small blind get out of the way and it's my turn. I decide to 3-bet here to 35. The cutoff doesn't think for too long and calls the 35. We see a flop of jack 6 deuce rainbow. Out of position, I c-bet this kind of board almost every time and that's what I do here as well. I downbet to 25 and after a small time of consideration the cutoff jams for 125 effective. I have no choice here, I guess. I had to fold and my opponent chose pocket kings. Another example how tight this table was, and after that hand I lose every hand I play for almost an hour, but then a very friendly VIP player joined the table who seems pretty drunk, who just wants to have a good time, and he's the target I want to play against in the next few orbits. But before that I see an opportunity to rebuy here. I rebuy for $200, so I'm in the game for 600 total now. I'm sitting at the stack at around 450. At this time I didn't realize that it's not allowed to have such a big stack. When I rebuy, the max buy-in is 300, but at the time I didn't realize that. But it seemed like everybody at the table was fine with my rebuy and no one said something, so let's go into the next hand. It's pretty nice when a loose drunk player joins your table, but what is even better, yes, to get that pocket aces right after that. Here I'm in the hijack and it folds to me and I raise it up to 10. The button behind me and the big blind decide to call and we see a flop 3 ways of queen, 9, 4 with 2 diamonds. The big blind checks to me and I definitely c-bet this here. I bet 16. Maybe I could bet a little larger here, but as played, both of my opponents decide to call. We see the jack of spades on the turn and after the big blind checks, I could check this here as well, but I decide to keep up the aggression here and bet 40. Immediately after that, the button behind me raises to 100. The big blind gets out of the way immediately and I don't think I should call here. This opponent is not the crazy drunk guy who just joined the table and I don't think that he raises here a hand like queen 10 or something like that. In my opinion he has 2 pair or better here, and if he had a flush draw he may would have raised on the flop, so after some time I decide to let my aces go and we go on to the next one. It's already 4 AM in the morning and the table starts to get a little looser. Here I'm in the cutoff with ace 9 of diamonds and it folds to me again and I raise to 10 again. All player behind me decide to call and we see a flop 4 ways. The dealer rolls over ace, 8, deuce with 2 spades and 1 club. The blinds check to me and of course with my top pair medium kicker I c-bet. I bet 20. Only the button calls and the blinds get out of the way and we see the 4 of clubs on the turn. It brings in the backdoor flush draw. There are 2 flush draws on board now, so I want to keep up the aggression here. I bet again, this time for 40. The button thinks for a small time, but then decides to call again. We see another ace, but the ace of spades on the river. It brings in the obvious front door flush draw, and I don't know if that's a really good card for me. My opponent called twice here, so he may have an ace himself or maybe a flush draw. So I'm not sure if betting here is the best option. I win versus smaller aces like ace 3, ace 5 or something like that, but I also lose to hands like ace 10, ace 4 for example. And of course I lose to mate flushes now. In the end I decide to check and my opponent quickly checks back. I show my hand and we are good. The button shows ace 5 offsuit, so he had indeed one hand we would have got some value from, but in the end I'm happy I scooped the pot and we go on to the next one. Around 30 minutes go by until we pick up our next hand, but it's a premium. We pick up pocket aces again. We are on the button this time and we see 2 limps before me and I raise it up to 15. One of the limper decides to call and we are only heads up now. We see a flop of queen 4-3 with 2 spades. My opponent checks and I c-bet for 15, which he calls. The dealer rolls over the deuce of clubs on the turn and my opponent checks to me again. I'm pretty sure I have the best here like almost ever, so I bet again, this time for 35. My opponent thinks for a little bit, but then calls again. We see an ace, but the ace of spades on the river. The obvious front of flush draw got there and there's a 4-liner to a straight now. And even worse, my opponent now leads into me, this time for 75. When I rewatch this hand, I'm pretty sure I lose almost ever in this spot here. But in this situation, I really go into the tank and I just thought I river top set here. How can my opponent beat me? Of course, he easily beats me with every 5 and the obvious front of flush draw. In the end, I want you to show my very bad played hands as well. And after a small time of consideration, I'm too bad to fold my hand here and I stick in the 75. And of course, we lose this hand. My opponent shows me 10-8 of spades for the rivered flush and we lose a pretty massive one. Just a few hands later, I pick up ace-4 of hearts in a low jack. It folds to me, I raise it up to 10 and only 3 players behind me decide to call and we see a flop 4 ways. The dealer burns and then shows us a very nice flop of 9-6-3 with 2 hearts. So we flop ourselves the nut flush draw and even though this board should slightly favor our opponent's ranges, I want to be aggressive here and I bet 20. Only the cutoff decides to call, so we are only heads up now and we see a jack of spades on the turn. Unfortunately, no improvement for my hand, but I want to keep up the aggression here and I'm stuck and maybe a little tilt. Because of all named reasons, I bet 45. Fortunately, this time for us, the cutoff decides to fold this hand and our aggression finally pays off and we scoop in this pot. Almost an hour goes by until we finally pick up a hand versus our drunk maniac friend in the cutoff. He raises to 15, the button behind him calls and I'm in the small blind with king queen offsuit. Since he has a VPIP of 70 and a preflop raise of around 50, king queen offsuit is a good candidate to 3-bet here. I squeeze to 50. Our friend in the cutoff calls and the button gets out of the way. We see a flop heads up and the dealer rolls over ace, king, deuce with 2 diamonds. Not really sure where I'm at, but most of the time I think I should bet this flop here, but I decide to check to my opponent who bets 40. Versus this kind of opponent there's no other option to call and that's what I do and we see a jack of hearts on the turn. Not really a card I was looking for, so I check to my opponent and he bets 50 now. It might sound crazy, but I still think my king could be good here versus this kind of opponent, so I decide to call. We see the queen of clubs on the river, so the obvious flush draw brick, and we have 2 pair right now. My opponent goes all in out of turn for 65 and I'm okay with this action. I call or I bet 65 no matter what. And let's see what my opponent shows us. He rolls over pocket 3s. Okay, so my read was kinda correct here and we scoop in the massive pot. Even better news, my opponent rebuys for another 300 and stay tuned, we will play some more hand versus this opponent. Around 15 minutes later I pick up ace jack offsuit from under the gun. I raise it up to 10 and we get 5 callers. So we see a flop 6 ways now of ace, king, deuce with 2 hearts. I c-bet for 30 and our VIP friend from the button decides to call. We see a queen of hearts on the turn and this brings in the obvious front or flush draw, so I check to my opponent. He decides to check back. We see another king on the river and since my opponent called here once on the flop and checks the turn, he may have a king, so I decide to check to him, see what he wants to do, but he checks back. The button proudly shows queen deuce offsuit, which I definitely counterfeit here on the river and we scoop in the small pot. Unfortunately for him, Israeli Ron wasn't on his side on the river here and yeah, let's go on to the next one. Only a few hands after that, we pick up pocket kings in the hijack. There's one limper before me and I raise it up to 13. 3 players, which includes the limper, decide to call and we see a flop 4 ways. The flop comes 3-3 deuce rainbow. They check to me, and on this dry board I c-bet for a small amount of 15, which only the big blind decides to call. So we see a turn heads up now, and it brings in the 10 of diamonds. There's a backdoor flush draw possibility now, and I realize at this moment that my opponent has around $120 left in his stack. He checks to me, and I want to size up now to go all in on the river, and because of that I bet 45. The big blind thinks for a little bit, but ultimately decides to call. We see the queen of diamonds on the river, and this card completes the backdoor flush draw. My opponent decides to check to me again. Even though I'm a little afraid of the backdoor flush draw, I think my opponent would lead here most of the time, and I want to get max value here with my overpair, so I put my opponent all in for his remaining 80. But unfortunately he relatively quickly folds, and because we are good with each other, had some drinks, I show my hand, and he later told me he folded a 10 here. On to the next one. It's already 6:25 in the morning and we are still playing. Here we pick up pocket queens in a low jack, and there is one limp before me. I raise it up to 15. It folds to the blinds, who both decide to call, but the limper gets out of the way, so we see a flop 3 ways of ace, 8, deuce, rainbow. You hate to see the ace on the board when you have pocket queens or kings, and even worse, my opponent in the small blind decides to lead. He bets 15. The big blind calls, and I think I get a very good price to peel at least once here and see what develops on the turn. So I call, and the dealer rolls over a magical queen of diamonds on the turn. So we bink our set here, and even better news, my opponent in the small blind keeps betting, this time for 25. The big blind calls again, and now I have a decision. There's a backdoor flush draw possible now, and the board gets more and more connected, and I want to build a pot now. So in the end I decide to raise here. I raise it up to 100. The small blind folds, but our VIP friend in the big blind calls. We see another ace on the river, so we boat up, and in general that is a really good card here, because my opponent in the big blind should have an ace very often here. But he checks to me. I'm not so sure anymore if he has an ace. Maybe he has a queen, but on the other side I double blocked that. Because of that thought, I don't want to bet too big here anymore. Just squeeze out a little bit of money, so I bet 120, which in hindsight is still a big bet here. And not so much time goes by before my opponent decides to call. I show my queens. This time he doesn't show his hand, but we scoop in a very nice pot. In the last hand we want to go over, we have king 10 of diamonds. We have to catch up with the action here. I'm under the gun and raise it up to 10. We get 5 callers, so we see a 6-way flop of 10 for deuce rainbow. With my top pair and decent kicker here, I c-bet, and we get 2 caller. The turn brings in the jack of clubs. There's a backdoor flush draw possibility now, and after the small blind checks to me, I check, and the opponent behind me checks as well. We see another jack on the river, and now my opponent in the small blind decides to bet. He puts out 75. Tricky spot, I would say. I don't think my opponent has a jack very often here. He could have a slow played monster like pocket deuces or pocket fours, but on the other hand, maybe he floats on the flop here with some sort of ace 3, ace 5 hand, turned the backdoor flush draw, and now has to bluff on the river. At least that was my thought process in this one, so I decide to call for 75. The player behind us fold, and we get the very bad news because my opponent shows us pocket tens. Yeah, we lose the last pot of the session, but overall we booked a nice win, and let's go into the session update. Guys, it's already bright outside, but we finished the session. It was a good one, especially at the end. We were into the game for $600 total and cashed out for 850. Late session heater once again. Good one. Thanks for watching, guys. See you in the next one, and goodbye.